Hello, and welcome to Political Science, Introduction to American Government. I am Dr. Dino Bozanelos, and I'll be lecturing on Chapter 9 in Maroney and Kirsch's book, By the People Debating American Government, entitled The Media. Please make sure that when you are listening to this lecture that you also have the PowerPoint for Chapter 9 available to follow along. I will frequently be referencing the PowerPoints as the semester progresses, especially when it comes to the graphs. You can either print out the PowerPoints, or for those of you who have Windows 7 and above, have a split screen with the PowerPoint available. It is my advice that you have the printed PowerPoint with notes from the lecture and the book on the PowerPoints before you take the quizzes. Many times students fare poorly on the quizzes as they are frantically looking for the answers without having read the book, or try to answer the questions simultaneously while watching the video. As the questions are randomized, this strategy won't work. So let's begin. This chapter is on the media, and in this chapter we will learn several things. First, we'll learn how the media is changing. We'll consider the democratic promises and pitfalls of new social media. We'll explore how the media is and is not biased. We'll understand the rules that channel, print, and broadcast into their current forms, and discover why the media in America is different from media in the other countries. Finally, we will assess how the media affects the ways we think and talk about politics. So American media today. Often when we talk about American media, we are usually talking about several different platforms. The first, and probably the one that you're most familiar with, is that of television. And television indeed remains a top source of news for most Americans. However, as you'll see, the audience is declining. The next major source of news for Americans are newspapers. However, newspapers are crashing. They've lost a third of their readers in the past decade, and in addition, many of their advertisers as well. Now, the third platform is radio, and radio hangs on primarily because almost everyone listens to radio, especially in their car, and a faithful few consider it their major source of news. What has really become the most important platform for news in the past 15 years is the internet. And the biggest change is the rise of the internet, which is seizing more and more of the media pie every year. Now, if you look at this graph here, what you'll see is the percentage of Americans who get their national and international news by the medium listed below. And while you see that television is still number one, you'll see that newspapers have fallen, newspaper readership, has fallen, whereas internet viewership has risen dramatically. So 50% of Americans say they get their national and international news by the internet, in comparison to 28% for the newspaper and 23% by radio. Now also too, if you just look this change is happening quickly. It's not just happening over decades. So this next graph shows us the percent change in audience just from 2011 to 2012, and you'll see that there's been a drop in viewership in regards to audio, magazines, newspapers, network TV, and locals TV. A little bit of a rise in cable, but mostly the biggest jump has been in digital news, where people go online to get their news sources. Now, the internet is already the main source of news among adults under 30, rising past television in 2010. And as figure 9.3 shows, 71% of young adults, which is considered between the ages of 18 and 29, consider the internet their main news source. In contrast, not many people over 65, just 18%, go online for their news. So the media's future rests in the hands, or some say on the thumbs, of the young, and the young are online. So just looking here, main news source by user age. If you look on the right, 65 years and older, people who are in the silent generation, they often receive their news from both television and newspaper, with internet and radio at a bottom third and fourth position. Whereas between 18 and 29-year-olds, or what we call millennials, you'll see that the internet now is the most important source of news for millennials, followed by television, newspaper, and then radio. In addition to the internet And encompassing this is also the idea of social media. Social media is another platform that has become very important on how millennials receive their news. And as Facebook's become more popular, it's also a way for more American adults to get their news regardless of age. So let's take a look. 64% of U.S. adults use Facebook, and about 30% of U.S. adults get their news on Facebook. Now, on 78% of Facebook news consumers, the reason why they get their news is not because they go there looking for the news, but because they're on the site for other reasons, usually checking updates or posts. 43% of Facebook news consumers think that the site is an important way to get news. 67% of Facebook users who visit more than an hour a day often get their news on Facebook, and that is compared to 41% who visit for less than an hour a day. So if you spend more time on Facebook, it's more likely that you're going to be receiving your news on Facebook. This makes sense. And many Facebook consumers consider Facebook in a very important way for them to get their news. Now, if you look at this graph here, it looks at the percent of Facebook news consumers who have interacted with news stories at least sometimes. And so what you see is that 64% of people who have gone on Facebook have clicked on links to news stories posted by others. 32% discussed new issues with people on Facebook, and 43% posted or shared links to news stories. 60% liked or commented on news stories, and 23% posted photos or videos on a news org or reporter's Facebook page. And this is sort of a version of what we call iReporting, where people are there at the scene and now they're posting videos and photos on a reporter's Facebook page. 66% say they see headlines about latest news stories on Facebook. Now, in regards to how much information do these Facebook users get, nearly half of all Facebook news consumers regularly get news on at least 6 different topics. However, just 34% of Facebook news consumers like or follow news organizations, reporters, commentators on Facebook. So you do see that while more Americans are turning to social media platforms like Facebook to get their news, it's not that they necessarily are still following news from news organizations, reporters, and commentators. More than likely, it's going to be on stories and links that have been posted by friends and family. Now let's take a look and let's kind of go through each one of these mediums or one of these platforms. Newspapers are the oldest platform there. Newspapers originally started in colonial America, and when beginning in colonial America, they were often very expensive to make. In fact, Benjamin Franklin started numerous newspapers, and he would actually have to hold the ink down on the print set, so that way the paper could absorb the ink, so then they could actually get the papers out. As you know, this is very expensive. That's why many newspapers weren't produced. In addition, many of your newspapers were produced by people who had particular views. We often call these partisan newspapers, where they really weren't looking to be objective. They were looking to promote their particular part of view. So, Thomas Jefferson had his newspaper, Alexander Hamilton had his newspaper, and they often opposed each other. Now, around the 1840s, this all changed with what we call the invention of the penny press. And the penny press, rather than holding a paper down to a flat sheet with typeset on it, it actually became a drum. And what you could do is put a piece of paper between 2 drums, and then you can ink both sides. And so this revolutionized newspapers. It greatly reduced the cost needed for a newspaper, and this led to the rise of what we now call mass media. Mass media is the idea that media is meant not just for elite consumers who can afford this, but for everyone. And so you see the development of very important newspapers like the New York Herald and the Tribune. These newspapers not only became important in terms of local news, but also national news as well. And newspaper influence grew rapidly during the 19th century. You'll see that after World War II, after the Civil War, as we industrialized and more people had disposable income, they would often buy newspapers to find out the latest goings on, the latest sports news, the latest everything. Now you can argue that
newspaper influence probably reached its zenith in the late 1890s with the Spanish-American War. As the Spanish-American War is a completely media-driven war. In this war, what had actually happened is that a naval ship by its name USS Maine was in the Havana harbor and it blew up. Now the media had strongly suggested that the destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy, and that many of them believed that it was Spain who had sunk the warship. Well, in the hysteria that had come out of this, what we saw was that, President McKinley and the Congress were galvanized by the public to go to war with Spain, and we did. We declared war on Spain, and we captured Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and the Philippines from the Kingdom of Spain. And so what we found out afterwards was that there was a boiler room accident in the USS Maine, and that the ship sunk because of this accident. Regardless, the media, in its yellow fever, as we called it back then, or yellow journalism, excuse me, in its yellow journalism, they were able to rile up the public, and the public demanded action. By the turn of the century, there were more than 2,200 newspapers, and we can see here that newspapers became an extremely important part for gathering and disseminating news, especially local news. The real decline in newspapers began around the year 2000, and again, it had to do with the proliferation of online news outlets. And so if you see here on this chart here, what you'll see is that starting around 2000, you see that advertising revenue adjusted for inflation for newspaper print has just bottomed out. And while many newspapers have now instituted what we call paywalls and subscription-only options, we see that digital advertising revenue from digital platforms for newspapers has not replaced the ad revenue from print. Will it? We're not quite sure, but they're definitely trying to stem this loss. Now, the media analysts see often two major problems with the decline in newspapers. First, newspapers, they still do the basic reporting. Who else is going to do it? There is an interesting notice here that yes, ordinary people could probably be reporters, but do they actually know what they're looking for? Are they trained writers? Can they get the right description out? The answer is probably not. Web-based outlets, they add opinions, background links, and multiple perspectives, but it all begins with stories developed by reporters. Second, important stories may get lost. Newspapers always covered the hot topics, along with less exciting civic issues, and since it was all one package, the popular stories paid for the civic lessons. Now, as newspapers downsize staff and try to sell their stories by the piece on the web, there may be no way to subsidize coverage, unlimited interest, but often very important issues like education. Now, radio is still holding steady. The first commercial radio station sprang up in the 1920s, and President Roosevelt was one of the first politicians to seize on the new technology during the Great Depression, delivering his fireside chats, which were weekly radio addresses to the nation during the Great Depression and World War II. Indeed, we often talk about how Roosevelt's voice often changed the relationship between Americans and the presidents. Whereas before, Americans didn't know their president personally. Now, by hearing Roosevelt's voice and then eventually seeing the presidents on TV, we talk about the rise of the personal presidency, or the idea that the president has a personal link to the public, which is made possible through 20th century media. Now, the radio era just lasted about 30 years. And by the mid-1950s, television had displaced it completely. There were three major radio networks: the American Broadcasting Corporation, the National Broadcasting Corporation, and the Columbia Broadcasting Service, that offered programming on radio. And when TV came around in the late 1940s, early 1950s, they just moved that programming over to television. Radio is still popular. despite the television and the internet. News radio and talk radio has probably become the most important political development since the 1990s. For example, there were only about 75 news and talk radio stations in 1980, and by 2009 we now see around 1,500. Now, Rush Limbaugh has really laid a foundation for conservative talk radio, and if you see here in this graph, you see that most of your top talk radio shows are conservative. And Limbaugh really did pave the way in the late 1980s and early 1990s with his radio shows. National Public Radio is a very popular talk radio format, but National Public Radio is not considered conservative nor liberal. As a public radio, it often receives grants from foundations to fund its programs on topics that they seem irrelevant to the public. So it's a non-profit enterprise. Now, television came onto the scenes in the 1950s, and it revolutionized both entertainment and politics. Not only now could we hear our entertainers and our politicians, we could now see our entertainers and our politicians. None other than John F. Kennedy himself, he took advantage of television to give his first press conference in 1961. It was such a novelty that 1 in 3 Americans actually watched to hear a young charismatic president who was a natural TV performer. And once again, the new media technology intensified the link between the people and their president. Now, television has changed over time. Television often saw itself as providing the news to the people, and over time our news has become what we call infotainment. And so what you're seeing is the line between news and entertainment beginning to evaporate. So daily news was monopolized by CBS and NBC in the 60s and 70s. And for those of you that are too young to remember, it used to be that, you know, parents would come home from work, there'd be dinner, and then at 6:30 everyone would sit down and watch Walter Cronkite. Or they would sit down and watch Ted Koppel at night, or they would watch these anchors that America had great trust in. Now you saw the rise of cable in the 1980s, which revolutionized news. No longer did you wait for 6:30 to get your news in the evening. You could now watch news all day long. And in fact, one of the most prominent events that led to seeing these 24-hour news channels becoming important was the rise of CNN, or cable news network, and it really sort of opened up the door to 24 Hours News Networks through its coverage of the Gulf War in 1991. I remember clearly in the Gulf War of 1991 listening to Bernard Shaw and how he would hold his microphone outside of the window so we could hear the bombings that were happening in Baghdad at that time. And so from that point on, a new format was born. And in this new format, this 24-hour news cycle, you know, White House staff and reporters were now on call 24/7. In 1996, Rupert Murdoch launched Fox News, a network with a conservative slant. And as Republican viewers headed for Fox, other cable networks, most noticeably MSNBC, moved to the left and developed shows with a liberal spin. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the lines between news and entertainment are blurring. And late-night talk shows are now getting into the political act. For example, Senator John McCain announced his candidacy for president on The Late Show with David Letterman. One of the more famous examples was that of President Clinton going on the Arsenio Hall show in 1992 and playing the sax. Nowadays, if you are running for president, or you are a major leader, it's important for you to come on to one of these late night talk shows for people to connect with you. But there's been a critique. A lot of the critique of infotainment has been, is this really news? And there's also been a critique because local news stations have also adopted to the idea of infotainment, but in their cases what they do is they often use sex appeal as a way to try and understand, or as a way to try and bring in new viewers. So for example, on the slide here, you'll see an example of a Fox 11 Los Angeles weather reporter by the name of Jillian Barbary. And Julian Barbary was often critiqued by media critics because of what she would wear, how she would act, and many argued that she was only on the show for sex appeal. And many people argued that that may be defeating the point of the news, that you're drawing in viewers just so they could see her rather than actually listen to the news. Whereas other people argue that as long as folks are coming in to listen to the news, that that's okay too, regardless of how they're being lured in, at least they're listening to the news. So there's various perspectives on this issue. Again, the line between news and entertainment is fading. One of the best examples of this is The Daily Show. The Daily Show is now taken over by Trevor Noah, but Jon Stewart, who preceded him for 16 years, merged comedy, entertainment, political talk, and savvy media criticism. And formats like The Daily Show are seeming to proliferate and becoming more popular as they now take a more sarcastic and humorous turn on political events of the day. The Daily Show is interesting because even though its viewership is not that big, it averages somewhere between 1 million people a night, which in a nation of 325 million isn't large. It is the major source of news for those between the ages of 18 and 29, if for those who watch cable news. And so it's interesting to see how important this is, because if young people need to be entertained to get their news, if they're not entertained, then they're not learning. And this is a potential issue because not everything that's newsworthy is entertaining. Okay. Now, it's interesting here is that in the book, the authors do a very interesting job of talking about the role of movies in politics, and that movies hold up a mirror to society. They often reflect emerging ideas, construct shared images, they promulgate metaphors, and can generate support for emerging ideas. Now, movies that have been very influential in politics include the first modern movie, which is called The Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation is notorious because it actually is a propaganda film for the KKK and for the system of racial segregation. And this is actually one of the first modern films ever produced. One of the more classic films is that of Gone with the Wind in 1939, which was a romantic portrait of the Old South. To Kill a Mockingbird in 1962, where a lawyer represents the optimistic New South where they fight injustice. Stand and Deliver in 1988, where an idealized portrait of a teacher in Latino Los Angeles. And more recently, 12 Years a Slave, which is more of a searing, clear-eyed take on the Old South. In this next slide here, you'll see there's a bunch of movies that we watch that reflect who we are as Americans. War movies, where we celebrate the righteous nation in the 1950s or criticize U.S. imperialism in the 70s. Wall Street, where greed is good, according to Gordon Gekko, and that will save America. Philadelphia, which talked about homophobia and AIDS in the 1990s. Wag the Dog, about launching wars to boost presidential popularity. Facebook, which talked about greed for status and not necessarily money. No More, a film about union organizing. And the Hunger Games series, which talks about tyranny and revolution, two clearly political themes running through that series. Now we see the rise of new social media, as I mentioned, or new media or social media, as we mentioned before. In 2012, Barack Obama skipped the traditional networks and newspapers and announced his re-election candidacy for president on a YouTube video. And so, when you see that, folks like leading presidential candidate Donald Trump are using social media as a way to bypass traditional news outlets and bypass traditional advertising as a way to reach out to folks, then you see that it's actually a very effective method. And so there is strong effects of new social media in the United States because we can trace news events through email and texting. And this is leading to what a lot of people talk about is a new era of citizen participation, where anybody can be a reporter by recording an event on a phone and posting it, as I mentioned earlier. And we refer to this as iReporting, and also the creation of what we call viral news videos. Or, some people argue, is it just an era of eroding news coverage? Because a lot of your online media sites rely on the same old news sources but avoid paying them. So for example, many of your search engines that aggregate stories together, like Yahoo, Huffington Post, Google News, and others, they don't actually pay for that content. And they link stories for free, which has led to further decline in advertising revenue for the newspapers. And again, as I mentioned earlier, newspapers have instituted paywalls as a way to try and stop the bleeding, to try and get away. So now if you click on an article in the Google News or in Yahoo and it links to an article by the Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal, for the most part, has put up a paywall. There's ways around it, but for the most part, they're trying to stop people from being able to view their stories for free. They want you to pay for their stories. Now, the next thing we talk about in the chapter is something important that you hear all the time. Is the media biased? And this is something that you hear all the time. There's bias in the media, avoid the media, don't trust the media. And both conservatives and liberals charge that mainstream media is biased. But let's take a look. Does ideological bias actually exist? And when we do a simple, this is an actual Pew Research Center poll done back in 2012, and it shows that conservatives are correct about the press corps' personal attitudes, that reporters in the mainstream media are more liberal than the country as a whole. Roughly 85% of the press corps calls itself liberal or moderate, compared to about 60% of the population. And although most reporters call themselves moderates, especially those in local media, where the number one runs well above 60%, very few are self-described conservatives. Moreover, the press corps tends to vote Democrat in presidential elections. So there you go. You would say, okay, you know what, here we go, Rush Limbaugh and other conservatives, they must be right then that the media is biased, don't trust the media. But interestingly enough, there's been plenty of studies to show that the media doesn't really lean either towards Democrats or Republicans. And okay, you're probably wondering, well, what do you mean, Professor? You just told me that these journalists vote Democrat or liberal. How could they not lean that way? Because honestly, what these folks lean towards is any story that drives viewership. It's not about being Republican or Democrat. It's about making money. It's profits that drive the news industry. Remember now, the media sells its audience to advertisers. So the prime directive is to expand the audience. And drama delivers audiences. We often say, if it bleeds, it leads. So on your local news, your most grisly event will be featured because that's what's going to draw you in. Not a great story about a mother providing for her child or a father working 3 jobs so they can make it. No, it's going to be a story about someone losing their life, a horrific accident, some natural disaster, something that gets your attention. And indeed, in presidential elections, the coverage focuses on the drama, not the issues. From Bill Clinton and his affair with Monica Lewinsky, all the way to the 2016 election, where Republican candidates Trump, Cruz, Rubio, and others go after each other in the debates, which led the president of CBS to say that the Republican debates have been good for business. And so people are not tuning in for the drama. They're not necessarily tuning in for the policy debates. And the drama is what sells for most of these things. So section scandal, as I mentioned, the bigger the name involved, the bigger the bonanza. And also a major shift that's happened is during World War II and after World War II, up until about the 1960s, or 1970s, I should say, the media had a really cozy relationship with Washington, D.C. The media would work well with the national government to get important news out or to make sure that certain stories weren't, leading to covers being blown for undercover intelligence officers. However, the Watergate scandal really changed reporters' relationship with politics. The Watergate scandal was a failed effort in 1972 by Republican operatives to break into Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. And recorded tapes that President Nixon himself had kept in his Oval Office showed that Nixon attempted to cover up the event, which led him to resign from the presidency. Now, ever since Watergate, journalists no longer saw themselves as chummy insiders, but now skeptical outsiders looking for the truth. And Watergate was especially significant in fostering the skepticism. And so reporters have now redefined their role, and no more do they just believe what politicians say. And when politicians are asked a question, they're now pressed by reporters because there's simply no trust. The last bias we look at is the fairness bias. We often argue that there has to be fairness in the way that media is being reported. And look, some issues do not have two equal sides. However, many of your 24-hour news channels, they try to present as if they're creating debate when one may not really exist. Okay, so how does the government shape the media? We've seen how technology shapes the media. In this case, we'll talk about how political rules can shape the development of media. And they can shape it in three ways. First, democratic nations organize the media usually by one way. Usually what happens is the government itself can fund the media. This is called the public ownership model, a situation in which media outlets are run by the government and paid for by tax dollars. This model is familiar in many nations, but that is not the case in the United States. Second, governments can regulate the media to ensure that it operates in the public interest. And the third way that governments around the world can affect their media or shape their media is to let the government just stand aside and let the market guide the media. The assumption in the private model is that private companies will give the people and the advertisers what they want. So let's look at then how the U.S. government shapes the media. The First Amendment protects print media from government regulation. Freedom of the press is a hallowed part of the First Amendment. And as we can see, there is some censorship. So for example, it is difficult to censor news, which is known as prior restraint. But you can hit someone with libel. You are able to restrict pornography, and in some cases forbid hate speech. So there are some limitations to the freedom of the press, but not much. Radio and television often fall into a different category when it comes to regulations. They've been subject to regulations from the start, and it's mostly because of bandwidth, the idea that there was only a limited amount of bandwidth for radio and television before the digital age. And so because of this, government had to regulate it. And so you had to make sure that the signals were not interfering with each other. And so the Federal Communications Commission began with its goal of refereeing the industry. And they would license stations on a given frequency, meaning no more overlapping signals, but in exchange, stations were asked to be socially responsible. And so when a station was asked to secure or renew its license, it had to show to the FCC how it was operating in the public's interest. And when television emerged, they simply extended this condition to television. So part of that was this idea of the fairness doctrine, where that each side of a public issue must get equal time. And this rule reflected the era's expectations in the 1940s of sober, nonpartisan coverage of news and politics. And while it was not strictly enforced, it did lead stations to shy away from political controversies. By the 1980s, President Reagan challenged the idea of the fairness doctrine. They ended up repealing it, and its consequences have been absolutely huge. Under the fairness doctrine, each talk show with a point of view would have to be balanced by another talk show from the opposite perspective. However, repealing the rule opened the door for media landscape we have today, which is a rich and raucous menu of news and politics that reaches across the political spectrum. The next thing is protecting competition. The market model is based on competition, so what happens if one corporation captures too much of the market? Might it diminish consumer choice? And consolidation is a real concern. Consolidation is when a media company grows acquires other companies and threatens to dominate the market, we feel from this perspective it might threaten free speech and fair debate. And so if you can see here in this slide, what you'll see here, it says that in 1983, 90% of American media was owned by some 50 companies, where in 2012, 90% of all media is now controlled by 6 major companies. The 6 major companies are Comcast, which controls NBC, Universal Pictures, and Focus Features; News Corp, which controls Fox, Wall Street Journal, and the New York Post; Disney, which controls ABC, ESPN, and Pixar; Viacom, which owns MTV, Nickelodeon, and Paramount Pictures; Time Warner Cable, which has CNN, HBO, and Time; and CBS, which owns CBS, Showtime, and the Smithsonian Channel. Now, those who favor deregulation respond that today's media takes so many different forms, from radio stations to online news, blogs, and tweets, that stiff competition for consumer attention is inevitable. And so the Telecommunications Act of 1996 reflected this second view and permitted many forms of cross-ownership. However, the debate about controlling media consolidation still lingers today. Now, if you look at how media shapes politics around the world, you'll see that government-owned stations are the norm. Censorship is often employed, and however, you're seeing the Americanization of media, and so you're seeing the rise of commercial media in many different parts of the world. But also, what you're seeing is the actual showing of American media throughout the world. So media around the world is changing, as it's changing here in the U.S. too. The biggest difference is going to be, though, that if you take a look at this chart, that most of your public public television is paid for by taxes. And if you look at Denmark, which 69% of the audience tunes into Danish TV, $130 per person go to taxes. So look at the United States, 1.2% of public media, and it's about $3.75 per person. Even that's extremely controversial in the U.S. So, public ownership of television is huge in Denmark, UK, Germany, and in other social democratic countries, whereas in the U.S. we often demand that everything be private. Now, how does the media shape politics? Well, news stories reinforce existing beliefs. In other words, what happens, imagine that you're a Republican with lots of Democratic friends. You come across a detailed news story that crushes one of their cherished beliefs. Do you send it to them with a snide comment? And if you do, what happens? Well, rather than changing their mind, what probably happens is the story simply reinforces what they believe. Researchers have discovered that new information rarely influences people who already have strongly held opinions. Instead, new information just kind of reinforces existing opinions, regardless of the content of the story. And I don't know if you find this conclusion surprising, but honestly, I don't. I think that, news stories really don't change the opinions of people who pay the most attention to news. I think news stories affect the people who don't pay attention to the news. So the more knowledgeable and the more you pay attention, the less likely a news story will sway you. So the less knowledgeable and the less likely you pay attention, the more likely a news story will affect you. Only when news stories have what we call a loud signal, and these are media stories with very broad coverage and an unambiguous message, are they likely to reach people and influence their views. But these loud signals are not happening as often as they used to, and they're not as prominent as they used to be. The second way the media can shape politics is what we call the political agenda. And the political agenda is where editors and reporters have enormous influence on what we are going to think about. Now, they're not telling us how to think, but they are telling us what to think about. For example, if they choose not to publish a story, we're not going to think about it. They have to publish it in order for us to think about it. So again, they're not telling us how to think, but they are telling us how to think about it. And so, the policy agenda is often set by the media, because we say these are the issues that the media covers and therefore the public considers important, and that politicians have to address. So setting the agenda is the first step in political action. And the surest route to put anything on the agenda, so let's say you're a politician and you want to get something on the agenda, is to go through the media. And setting the agenda is one of the most important influences the news media has on American politics. Politicians know this, and they will do what they can in order to get this out. In the recent 2016 election, Republican candidate Donald Trump often argued that if it wasn't for him, immigration would not have been on the news agenda. He's mostly correct, because it was a topic that neither party really wanted to address in the 2016 election, but because he kept saying it, the news stories picked it up, and then it ended up becoming an issue again. And again, this is while it is an issue and people have thought about it, it's not an issue that either party wanted for the election, and it has become an issue for the election. Now, there's two main ways that the news media can affect you and how you understand politics. The first is called priming. Priming affects voters or polls respondents' perceptions of candidates or public officials by raising issues that are perceived to enhance or diminish the issue or the candidates. And so what we mean by this is that you're actually priming. In other words, you are getting your audience ready by using particular words and phrases in order to get them to understand the issue. And then I'll show you an example in the next few slides. The next one is framing the issue. Framing the issue is where sort of now that you've primed them, sort of gotten them ready to understand the issue, now this is how you're going to frame it. Are you going to frame it in a negative way, a positive way? Are you going to frame it in a liberal way, a conservative way? Are you going to frame it in a national or international? Lots of different ways of which you can frame the article. Often think of framing as, let's say, like framing a house. The house will look, the shape and the size of the house really depends on the framing. And this is exactly the case when we're talking about here in the media. So taking a look here, let's look at three ways of understanding how the media affects politics. The first is setting the policy or political agenda. So back in 2003, the U.S. went to war with Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein, and that was the #1 news story. The attacks that happened in March of 2003 were the #1 news story. This is the focus. That same day, millions of people had marched in about 20 to 25 cities against the war, but that got very little coverage. The coverage that was given was the shock and awe campaign that had begun in March of 2003 to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And so why does this matter? Well, because it sets the agenda. The focus is on the conflict, not on the rallies at home against the war. And this reflected public sentiment. 70% of Americans were for the war, 30% were against the war. So it's not a surprise then that the American media focused on the conflict, as that is the actual content that the public was interested in. In addition, remember what we said earlier, if it bleeds, it leads. It's much more entertaining and much more important for news media sources to get out about the conflict, as that's something we might be more interested in simply because of the violence associated with it. And so this is what we're talking about, setting the policy or the political agenda. When we're talking about priming, we're talking about the words that you use to try and understand a particular issue. And so this is what, for example, a great example of this is what we call Obamacare versus the Affordable Health Care Act, or the ACA. Now, for those of you that don't understand, they are one and the same. So what had happened is back in 2009, when President Obama was inaugurated, he pushed forward a plan for universal health care. This plan for universal health care was adopted in 2010 and took effect the next year in 2011, with certain parts of it rolling out over the next 10 years. Its official title is the Affordable Health Care Act. But because it was proposed by President Obama and it promotes universal health care, and Republicans and conservatives who are often for minimal government, and often are against government expansion into areas like healthcare or more government regulation, they derisively called it Obamacare. And so Obamacare has stuck. So, and it became official in about 2012 when Mitt Romney, who was running against Obama in Obama's reelection, he said, President Obama, can I call it Obamacare? And Obama said, yeah, call it Obamacare. That's fine. So we hear it called Obamacare. We hear it called the Affordable Health Care Act. They're one and the same. But I want you to see how priming has an effect. Because when you hear, do you oppose the Affordable Health Care Act? Only 37% of Americans in a particular survey said they did. But in that same survey, when they asked people, do you oppose Obamacare, 46% said that they did, almost a 9% difference. What you're seeing in this survey is that Obamacare carries this sort of negative connotation, especially if you happen to be someone who doesn't like President Obama. Whereas affordable health care, if you take out the president's name, even if you don't like President Obama, you think, yeah, well, I like affordable health care, and so you end up saying, I support this. And so it's just very interesting sort of how priming can really have an effect. We also now look at framing, and framing is how to understand a particular issue. So these two signs that you see here are coming from a recent Supreme Court case where a company, Chick-fil-A, said that they refused to give a certain type of birth control pill called the morning after pill to its workers or to its employees as mandated under the Affordable Health Care Act of 2010. And so Chick-fil-A argued that the Affordable Health Care Act's mandate to provide birth control to all of its employees, specifically the morning after pill, violated its religious freedoms. And so in many conservative and Republican news articles, they often talk about that they frame this as protecting religious freedom. Whereas many liberal and many Democratic news articles and news reporters, they often frame this as a Republican war on women. That simply Republicans and conservatives didn't want to pay for birth control, and so that they had to stop the Republican war on women. So one issue, right, but it's being framed in two different ways, and so I think it's important to understand this. All right, and finally we're going to talk about the media's electoral connection. Media coverage has evolved and now devotes much less time to a candidate's speeches. In 1968, the average clip of a candidate speaking on the news, or what we call a soundbite, was uninterrupted for over 40 seconds. Today, the average clip has fallen under 8 seconds, and then after those 8 seconds, the candidate's speech is simply the backdrop for another anchor or a pundit. Now, you might see the candidates gesture and move their lips, but those are just backdrops for analysis, often centered on why the candidate is winning and losing. So, when you're running a campaign, you've got to have some really simple slogans that you can get out and simple messages. If you make too many complicated messages, you're not going to be able to get your message out. So for Barack Obama, hope and change were very powerful messages. Donald Trump, make America great again. Anything under 8 seconds that you can get out quickly, so that way the American people can latch onto. Scandals and gaffes now become the news. And so anytime there's a hint of a scandal, and what they do is they go over every speech and every debate looking for blunders. And now what's happened is, effective campaigns have developed rapid response teams that can deal with whatever crisis sort of gusts through the media on that day. Finally, we look at candidate profiles. Candidate profiles are often what we call powerful narratives. The media often what they do is they sketch a profile of each candidate. However, it can be simplistic, exaggerated, and very hard to escape. This image then can shape future coverage. And once the portrait develops, it often reverberates through the world of infotainment. The behavior then fits, immediately gets airtime, reinforcing the narrative. So, for example, they often talked about Barack Obama as being no drama Obama, as being cool and aloof. The press played Mitt Romney as being the out-of-touch rich guy. They had the top 10 Romney wealth gaffes, leading to the quip that he appreciated American cars because his wife drives a couple of Cadillacs. Narratives about women often fall into gender stereotypes, especially in regards to Hillary Clinton, who has been cast as the shrew or the scold or the harpy or the emasculator. You know, Sarah Palin, when she was the vice presidential candidate in 2008, they portrayed her as a ditz or a diva or a hysteric or a dim but charming beauty queen. So rarely, you know, do they get a chance to actually define themselves. And these media profiles are simplistic and exaggerated, and as we know, can be very hard to escape. So in conclusion, we're at the crossroads of the media world. What makes American broadcast media unusual is that it's always been a commercial enterprise. Television is being squeezed by the web and other new media. And important issues like education, the environment, and impartial analysis of the healthcare system cannot survive in this chase for audience where victory goes to the loudest or to the most outrageous. Now, there is changing. Remember I said that politics is always about change. So some of the stuff that we're seeing is that American media does reflect its nation and the people. We are seeing a rise in Spanish language networks, and we're also seeing a rise in religious networks, reflecting the fact that the mainstream media does not respond to either Spanish language members of our society or to religious members of our society as well. All right, so this concludes the lecture on Chapter 9, the media, in Moroni and Kirsch's book, By the People, Debating American Government.